So 2 days of conferences, I'm the last talk. All I have to do is not spoil it for you. You've got lots of great ideas and enthusiasm. All I have to do is just say a few nice things, positive things, and not spoil it for you. So let's talk about phobias. Everyone has phobias. Flying, heights, spiders, snakes, IOC containers. Everyone has phobias. But my phobia is worse than all of your phobias because my phobia is introducing myself. And that's really difficult for me. And it's a problem I've had for a very long time, and it's always the worst part of preparing for talks. But recently, my phobia was cured, like cured instantly. I was coming back from my French lesson, and I received an email out of the blue. And this email said, "Hey, Nick, I saw one of your videos, and I was really impressed. You're like a combination of Martin Fowler and Eminem." And I wasn't sure how to take it, and I thought, that's as good as it gets, I'll take it. So, so that's my bio. That's honestly my bio for today. But I do have one more thing to tell you about myself, and I have to say this. So I work for a company called Navico, working in marine electronics. It's a really interesting domain, moving from hardware focus to lots of opportunities on the technology, digital cloud side. And if you are looking for a new opportunity, we're always looking for good people, so please let me know. But I don't want to talk about this today. I want to take you back a few years. So start of my career, I was working for a company who worked in a way you might be familiar with. So working in 3-week iterations. At the end of every iteration, big crazy, everyone's trying to merge their code. It's all being tested by QAs, last-minute emergency fixes, all that kind of stuff. And then after the code goes live, developers spend 2 days manually testing all of the features across all of the devices. There's so much stuff to test. The QAs can't do it. All of the developers have to test it. And I thought this was normal until I went to work for another company. So I thought this was just how software works. These releases, complicated merging, loads of manual testing after each deploy, like 10-hour deployment processes. I thought this was all just normal stuff. Then I went to work for another company, and on my first day, I paired up with a senior. We wrote some tests, we wrote some code, we wrote some tests, wrote some more code, and then he said, "Press this button." So I pressed this button, and he said to me, "You just deployed to production on your first day." I'm like, what? No testing or none of this stuff. And so that was kind of amazing to me. Being in a company like this where we're just deploying every day, 25 times a day, on your first day, on your last day, you're just deploying all the time. Completely blew my mind. And what was interesting, I started trying to understand, so what's special about this company? Why are they different? Why are they working in this way? How did they get here? And I'm oversimplifying a bit, but basically a new manager came in, and he said to the teams, "You're smart, figure out how you want to work, and just make it happen." And those teams, they got to continuous delivery. They figured out the best way to do it. And having that autonomy transformed their capabilities to deliver software. So that was amazing for me, but I kind of got a bit carried away. And I started thinking, oh, I know how software works now. I know how to make a good team. Every company I go to now, I'm going to touch them with my magic hands, and they'll be just doing this continuous delivery stuff in like a week or something. So I had a few issues when that didn't quite work at companies after that. But then I kind of started learning things again. So I went to work in the UK government, and I was working with 3 teams. We got to continuous delivery quite quickly. But more interestingly than continuous delivery, we were doing continuous discovery. So we had a user researcher. Every team had a user researcher, and every iteration, the user researcher would go out and talk to some customers, to some users, sorry, but not just the user researcher, the whole team. Developers would go with the user researcher to the research lab, and they would be there seeing customers talking about the products they build. And the developers who didn't go would watch the videos later. And what happened here was the developers weren't just technically brilliant excited about 25 deploys a day. But now, even the most introverted developers were passionate about solving the customer problem and contributing to the product backlog, product ideas, and it brought the whole team alive, this autonomy to actually define the product they were building. So again, I'm seeing the benefits of autonomy. And it was kind of mind-blowing. This one opportunity came up where we had to go into central London and meet some big companies who were using the services. And one of the junior developers said, "Can I go into the big meeting?" I'm like, yeah, why not? That's pretty amazing that he was the most introverted person on the team, but he felt he was so part of this product, he wanted to go to that meeting. And that was pretty amazing. So this autonomy brought the team alive, but later we started having problems. So I can give you an example. So user research, get some feedback. Users are saying, "I can't register with your service. Your address field is 4 lines long, but my address is 6 lines long. So I'm still using the paper-based form. That's a waste of their time, and it's a waste of our time." So we're like, okay, we'll fix it. We'll make it a bit longer. But then we had to ask the back-end team to update the API, the data team to update the data API, the database team to update the database schema, the internal teams to update the case management internal systems. So a week later, I'm sitting in a meeting with 5 project managers to put a text box on a web page. And I'm feeling a little bit frustrated that something so simple that would have taken like 2 hours at my previous companies is now taking weeks just to talk about it. But I'm like, okay, it takes time in some companies, but we'll get there. 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in a meeting with 5 project managers to put that text box on the web page. We're not getting anywhere. And now this is becoming a problem because the team is losing their motivation. Now they don't have the autonomy. They don't own the end-to-end slices of the systems they're building, so they can't solve those problems. Motivation goes down, people quit. Eventually, everyone left. It was that bad. So this autonomy stuff, it's not just me who found out how important it is. So Nicole Forsker and Jez Humble, they did some surveys over the past few years, and they found out a loosely coupled software architecture and an organizational structure to match, i.e. autonomous teams, is one of the biggest predictors of continuous delivery performance. But someone else found something similar too, ThoughtWorks. In their studies on their projects, they found that when a piece of work leaves a team, when multiple teams collaborate on a piece of work, it takes an order of magnitude longer to complete. On my project, there were 5 teams, and it took 50 orders of magnitude longer to complete. So I can completely believe this statistic. So autonomy is super important, but it's also very difficult to get right. It's not this magical pixie dust we just sprinkle on, or we just tell people, you're autonomous, go away and do stuff. It's not that easy, it's super difficult. And we see stories like this all the time from Segment. They went from a monolith to a microservices, they got their boundaries wrong, and they went back to a monolith. They rewrote their system twice, which isn't always the most efficient way to build software. So, but respect to them for sharing this article, definitely respect to them, not criticizing them. So we have these problems. We need autonomy, but it's hard to find. So I think there are some fundamental aspects or patterns or anti-patterns that we can learn from first to avoid making the common mistakes. And so the first pattern or the first concept I'd like to share with you is something I call Robin Hood autonomy. So when people talk about giving autonomy and making people autonomous, that's actually a trade-off. If I'm giving you autonomy, I'm saying you can make a decision. You can own this thing and make decisions about it. But that means me or someone else doesn't own it. We don't have the autonomy, we've given it to you. And this applies to designing software systems too. To put autonomy in one place, we have to take it away from another. That's how autonomy works. So the first anti-pattern we see a lot is when we design systems and we think everything has equal value. Everything should have the same amount of autonomy. But that's not true. And what happens when we do this is we start coupling things that have high value with things that have low value. So as a business, we want to invest our time in the parts of our system where the payback is greatest. But if high-value things are coupled to low-value things, when we want to change a high-value part of our code, we have to spend time navigating the low-value parts that are coupled to it, or understanding how they work. So ideally, we want to get to a place where the boundaries in our systems enable us to spend our time where the payback is greatest. That's the first heuristic. When we're designing systems, we should try and align things by value. But that's not the only one. So another problem is, if we only align by value, we can end up with dependencies in our system, because high-value things do depend on lesser-value things. So there will always be some coupling there, and we can't focus only on value. And what happens if we don't think about coupling is we start creating arbitrary boundaries. And here's a pattern I've seen a number of times in the past 6 months alone. This old code base sucks. All new code base will live in the new sexy code base. A few months later, now I have to change 2 code bases because things in this new code base are coupled to this old code base. This always happens all of the time. So second heuristic, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, is align the boundaries with the business domain. But that's only 2, there are more. So another one is thinking about complexity and the size of things. So if we break our system up into lots of small pieces owned by small 2-pizza teams, it's going to be very simple for those teams. Small team, small software, small focus, they can make those very small pieces very simple. But now the complexity moves at a global level, and now there's a greater chance of teams having to work together on a single piece of work. And we know that that will take an order of magnitude longer to complete. So let's make our teams bigger. But if we make our teams and our software services bigger, now there are more people in your team, and social complexity increases. You need to keep up with all the other people in the team and what they're working on. You're getting Slack notifications non-stop because there are so many people in your team, and your stand-ups take about half an hour because there are like 20 people. And I've been in there too, so I know this is true. And also, on the social side, we need to realize that architecture is politics. The way we shape our systems affects the balance of power in our organizations. Let's go back to that story about the UK government. Let's say we had an amazing idea. Let's create these autonomous teams who own end-to-end slices. How's that going to work now? One of those managers is going to lose their power. But both of those managers of those 2 different departments are fighting over the next promotion. Only one of them can get the promotion. And the one who owns the most services, the most teams, is likely to get the promotion. So now it's about personal conflict. And I call this the Game of Thrones heuristic. Whoops, did I just have this on? I meant to show this, sorry. So I call this the Game of Thrones heuristic, which is basically everyone wants to sit on the throne, design your systems knowing that people are competing for power in your organization. And people think this kind of thing doesn't happen, but let me give you an example. There's a famous Australian company called Bunnings. Anyone heard of Bunnings? So Bunnings is like a big garden store. I was recently laying a patio in my garden, and I went to Bunnings and I bought a massive spade like this for like digging stuff. But that's not the story. So Bunnings, they came to the UK. They're like, we want to enter the UK market, dominate the UK market. So they bought a big franchise in the UK called Homebase, and they had this plan. They said, what we're going to do is work in an agile way. We're going to start turning these Homebase stores into Bunnings. But instead of doing it in a big bang, massive rollout all in one piece, we'll do a couple of stores at a time. We'll convert them into Bunnings, we'll try some ideas out, we'll see what works, and then we'll scale it. So that was their plan. But there were 2 things that Bunnings weren't thinking about that they should have been thinking about. Firstly, they gave their teams in the UK high levels of autonomy. Get things done how you need to get things done. And also, at the same time, there was a contest in the company to become the next CEO. So all of the managers in the UK were like, I'm not waiting to turn my store into a Bunnings. I need to be first, and I need to be the best because I want to be the CEO. $1.7 billion later, that did not work, and the whole thing failed because of those personal conflicts. So this stuff absolutely does happen. So that's the third heuristic. Think about social needs when you're designing systems. Making people happy and thinking about the power struggles in your company. So here's another one that affects our boundaries. I was working for a company a few years ago, and customers were complaining. When I look at your catalog, I see one price, but when I pay, I see another price. What's going on here? It turns out we had two services, separate databases, and they were updating prices at a different frequency. The catalog was doing an overnight rebuild, 24-hour refreshes. The pricing service was like consistently up to date. So the technical boundaries here, there were technical reasons that affected our boundaries. Obviously technical ways to solve that as well, but technical choices obviously affect our boundaries. So that's heuristic 4. And there's one more. So UI. We talk about having these end-to-end teams to make them more autonomous, but what do we lose by having this? We now have a user experience that's owned by multiple teams. Have you ever used a product where it feels like the user interface is telling you about the organizational structure of the company that built it? It's like, that page looks like it was built by one team. That page looks like it was built by a completely different team who were probably drinking a bit more. That page is quite cool, but it looks nothing like the others. So yeah, now we have this problem on the UI. And so we try and go for even more autonomy with the micro front ends, which can work, but it can also lead to even more fragmented user experiences. And then we get to this world of BFFs and multiple devices. So we have to have the front end anyway, the multiple front ends and the back end teams. Now we have to add 3 text boxes to 3 web pages and all the back end stuff. So it's difficult, and there's no obvious answer here. So that's the 5th heuristic. Thinking about UX, even when you're in the back end making data changes and API changes, there's nearly always an impact on the user experience somehow. So let's focus on value now. What do we mean by value anyway? How do we use value to guide the design of our systems? Let's have a look at an example. So this company, they build marketing and advertising products. One of their products is, as a business, you use their product to create advertising campaigns on Facebook, on Twitter, and LinkedIn. Now, the company started off by having support for Facebook only. You can only put ads on Facebook. And that was working well. Facebook was probably the best market where the most customers were. That made sense to do that. But then one day, the sales team came in and said, we just closed a massive deal for like X millions. You developers have X weeks to implement Twitter and LinkedIn support. I'm sure you can imagine how the developers felt with this. But they were up for it. It was a good culture in the company. They wanted to solve this problem. And so they thought, how can we do this in such a short time frame? So they looked at the Twitter and LinkedIn APIs, and they thought, actually, if you squint your eyes, it's very similar to the Facebook model. There are lots of similarities here. If we just make our code base generic, so it can plug into any social media network, we can implement this thing pretty quickly. And they did. They hit that deadline. They actually did it, which was amazing. But then it went back to business as usual. And 95% of their backlog was adding new Facebook features. And the business are now saying, why is it taking 5 times longer to implement Facebook features? Most of our customers want Facebook features. Our competitors are now iterating much faster than us because it's taking us so long to add Facebook features. No one really cares about Twitter or LinkedIn anymore. That decision caused that product to fail and that team to be fired. Those developers thought they were heroes hitting this deadline. But actually, they made $1 million mistake, and they didn't even realize it because they didn't understand the value of the choices they were making. That's about value. There are many heuristics for looking at value. Look at your organization's investment strategy and growth strategy. Put autonomy in places where there's the most value in your system. Those are some ideas. On the opposite side of things, we don't always want maximum autonomy. Sometimes we do want to reduce duplication. A UK supermarket was having a similar problem. They had a bunch of these teams, autonomous, but they were all implementing lots of the same functionality. And overall, it was massively inefficient. So they created a separate contact service to reduce that duplication. So I just want to say here that it's not always about autonomy. These teams have now lost a bit of autonomy, but overall, they save some time. So it's a trade-off there. And my advice here is always understand your organization's business model. It won't help you to make perfect decisions, but you might start to see $1 million decisions as you're making them. It's not perfect, but it helps. And also, when we think of value itself, value is not just about money and the things customers will pay for. Think about your favorite search engine. So you don't have to pay to search on Google. But if they didn't have the search feature, you probably wouldn't use it because that's the main feature of the product. They make money via ads. And this is a common problem I see in lots of companies, where people think the bits of the system that make the money are the most important, are the core domains. But actually, there are parts of the system that users care about more than the core domains. These features increase engagement in your product. And so another example here is a pattern called the dog food context. This picture makes me hungry. Another pattern called the dog food context. So I worked for a company a few years ago who were building a music platform. So this platform was a bunch of APIs. You could use these APIs to create your own music streaming platform like iTunes. Just put your own website on top of the APIs or your own mobile app. Now, we had one team who were building a website, and we said no. So this team were building a website on top of our own platform. And we said, no, we don't want a team to own an end-to-end slice. We want the team to be separated from the platform because we want the team to feel the pain our customer is feeling, and we can use that feedback to improve our core product. So again, what we think of as value, that feedback is extremely valuable, more important than making money on that product. But maybe the manager of that product wants to make money to show how good he is. So we get back to the trade-offs again about the political side of things. Anyway, that's just a quick example. So that's value. How do we start looking at our domain to minimize the dependencies between things? So we need to understand the domain we're working in. I'm pretty sure you've had lots of good ideas about that already. But one area I'd like to challenge, when we're creating boundaries, I see lots of very naive examples. Like, oh, I'm going to create an order service and a payment service and all these basic things that seem obvious. But actually, I want to challenge you because you can categorize the concepts in your domain in different ways. Categorization is multidimensional. Let me give you an example. A few weeks ago, my wife made the most amazing Sunday lunch. I mean, she's a chef. She always cooks good food. But this meal was, like, fantastic. I'm like, OK, I need some dessert today. To celebrate this amazing meal, let's have a dessert. And I said, let's have Viennetta. I've not had Viennetta for, like, 10 years. Let's have a Viennetta. And she said, let's get some squirty cream and some chocolate sauce. Yeah, let's do that. That sounds amazing. So I put on my coat, put on my shoes, went down to the supermarket, and I started looking for the chocolate sauce. And I walked over to the dessert section because chocolate sauce goes with desserts, right? I couldn't find chocolate sauce anywhere. I'm like, no chocolate sauce. What am I doing wrong? Chocolate. Of course. Chocolate sauce, it goes with desserts, but it's also chocolate sauce. So I go to the chocolates, and there's no chocolate sauce there either. I'm like, what am I doing wrong here? Chocolate sauce. Oh, chocolate sauce. It's a sauce. So I go to the sauce section. Ketchup, barbecue, mayonnaise, mustard, Levi Roots reggae sauce. But I'm not seeing any chocolate sauce. I'm like, what am I doing wrong here? So I start looking for someone who works there. And I see this guy, and I'm not lying to you. I see this guy, and he's got pizzas and cakes and Scotch eggs and pork pies stacked up to his nose. I can barely see his face, and I can see he doesn't want me to disturb him, but I need my chocolate sauce. And I say to him, hey, where's the chocolate sauce in this place? And he says to me, it's down by the ice cream. But I'm like, it can't be by the ice cream because there are no shelves by the ice cream. It's all freezers down by the ice cream. It can't possibly be there. So I'm like, this guy's lying to me. He wants me to get out of his way. I'm going to get him fired, but first, I'm just going to make sure there's no chocolate sauce down by the ice cream freezers where there are no shelves. So I'm in the middle. You know how supermarkets have aisles, and then two sides, and a lane in the middle. So I'm walking in the middle. I get to the ice cream. I turn left, and right down there, I can see this trolley thing, like a disused lunch trolley, like someone's been carting around lunch, and they just abandoned it here. So I start walking close, and I can see, like, is that chocolate sauce? And I took a picture to prove it. There was an abandoned lunch trolley with chocolate sauce and shampoo by the ice cream. Still trying to work that one out. I don't know what the others are. But my point here is, this chocolate sauce has so many relationships with other concepts, and there are different ways we can group these things. And sometimes looking for that simple, obvious solution is wrong. Now, what does this have to do with software? Well, here's an example. Here's a company who build a financial products marketplace. So in this marketplace, you can get credit card deals, you can get mortgage deals, you can get loan deals. Where are the boundaries here? That's obvious, right? Credit card context, mortgages context, loans context, simple. Let's write a blog post about how easy it is to find boundaries in our systems. But actually, when you start building this system and you start talking to the domain experts, you notice that, well, there are high-value credit card deals for people with lots of money and a fantastic credit rating. And there are low-value deals for people who've been bankrupt and can't get deals anywhere else. And this pattern is in the mortgages part too. And it's in the loans part too, these parallel hierarchies. We've now got two ways to classify things. Which are the correct boundaries here? You don't know. If 95% of your revenue comes from really wealthy customers with a fantastic credit rating, maybe that's your boundary. But if 95% of your revenue comes from credit cards, maybe those are your boundaries. You don't know until you understand the value and your domain. And in fact, things will change together at different times based on what you're trying to achieve as a business. What's in your backlog? What's on your product roadmap? That's going to determine the coupling in your system. Coupling is not an inherently technical thing based on the domain you're working in. It's actually based on what's in your backlog, what's your strategy. That affects how things will change together. I also want to talk about patterns. I'm really disappointed that we've had 15 years of DDD, and no one has really been looking at the strategic patterns in relationships between bounded contexts. So I want to start with a couple of the basics. So before we jump to our naive implementation of the first boundaries that seem to make sense, there are always at least two ways of looking at things. So firstly, we have processes. We take our business process, we break it down into a series of steps, and each step could be a boundary in your system. So in the advertising example, we might have a campaign builder, campaign executor, analyzer, and an optimizer. But we might also be capability aligned instead. So we might have a creatives context. Now, creatives are the visual, the text, the images, the audio, the sound. When you see an advert in your feed on Facebook or Twitter, for example, that's a creative. So you might have a creative context, and now our process cuts through each of these different capabilities. So there are two choices there. And that leads us on to the patterns. So a very basic pattern is an entity lifecycle pipeline. We have this linear process. Each step is a context. That's a boring pattern. That's an obvious pattern. But imagine if you knew about this pattern, you used it in one company, and you tried to use it in another one where it didn't quite fit. So here's an example. It's kind of a dumbed down, simple example. That's not entirely accurate, but imagine you worked for a company that did planning flights and stuff. So first part of your process is to generate the journeys, and then you work out which planes will go on which journey, and then you work out which crew members will go on each flight. And you use the entity lifecycle pipeline because you have 3 people in your company who are responsible for each step. It's a basic example, but bear with me for a sec. And you have a rule which says whenever something changes, the person who currently owns this in-progress piece of work has to fix it. So if the fleet changes or the routing changes, but it's got to here, it's the crew person's job to fix it. So now you have this problem where you're trying to do entity lifecycle pipeline, but you have to make it work, you have a dependency, because all of the rules need to be shared with these different contexts. But actually, in this domain, we might think, oh, I've seen this problem, this pattern before. I'm going to use a proposal pipeline. And the proposal pipeline says, don't change things in place. If something changes and invalidates the data, just send it back to a previous stage. That's a very simple and basic example. There are lots of these patterns. And I want people to go and find more of these patterns between bounded contexts, because I think it's really interesting. And each of these patterns will have economical, technical, what's the other one? Political, yeah. So each of these patterns has different characteristics, and it's important to be aware of them. So another pattern is the octopus context. So GDPR is a good example of this. I was working with a company building a GDPR system, and they had an octopus. So a request comes in, the customer says, delete all my data, and the octopus says to all the services in the company, delete all the data you have for this customer, and send me an acknowledgement within 2 days. I'm going to chase you down, and there will be trouble because the company gets fined billions or something. At first, actually, that's the pattern. What are the challenges here? So the challenges here are try to centralize complexity in the octopus, because otherwise, each of the consumers has to duplicate lots of work. In this example, one of the ideas on the table was each of the services can have a message queue, and the octopus will put a message on their queue saying delete the data. But then we had teams saying, we don't have a message queue, we don't manage message queues, it's a lot of work for us, we don't want to have to implement all of this queuing stuff. And we had other people saying, I'm about to build a new service. To put this thing in production, I need to have message queues set up. That's a big barrier. And so we were able to reduce loads of that complexity by having all of the process management inside the octopus. We save lots of downstream work there by centralizing that complexity. Another one is about design up front. So we have this idea that it's good to be agile, to build something, to release it, and to iterate quickly. That doesn't work if you release something and 10 other teams all depend on it. Your ability to change that quickly is gone. And that's a problem I see in this kind of architecture, where we have one component and it has lots of dependencies. If the initial design is wrong and you need to change it later, you've now got 10 teams all saying, no, 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 no. We integrated with your service because we had to, and now we have our own backlog. We're not updating to your version 2. And you have all kinds of political problems, escalating it to management. It's horrible. So a bit of design up front can save a lot of time when you see this kind of pattern. And so that's my point here. Look for these patterns and look at the different trade-offs on the political, the technical, and the economical sides. So one last section I wanted to look at is the other 3 heuristics. Obvious statement, developers are not fungible resources. They're not, you can't just move people around between teams and projects and expect them to be exactly the same productivity in different teams. It doesn't work that way. There's an onboarding and a ramp-up cost. We all know this. We're software developers. But what we don't really think about is actually how can we maximize the design of our systems so that the people who are building them are happy and productive, because the way we shape the boundaries can have those kind of impacts. So I like to call this the Dan Pink heuristic, based on his book Drive. Let's design our systems, let's find boundaries that enable people to be, what was it now? Have purpose, autonomy, and mastery. Can't believe my mind went blank there. And one way we can not do this is when we create layered architectures. So we have the front-end team who want to put a text box on a web page. We have the back-end team who have to update the APIs, and then we have the internal teams. And this anti-pattern is what I call the selfish silo. So the front-end teams, they're now saying, well, these internal teams, they're not helping us. We need to put a text box on a web page, but they're not helping us. But by the time you get to this layer of the architecture, this team has no idea what the customers are asking for. And this team is probably being measured on how much work they get done. And so if these teams are asking them, do this text box, change their mind, they're going to get less work done, and they're going to be measured in a negative way. It looks like, oh, you haven't been working hard, you got less work done this time, what's wrong with you? So this team seems selfish, but the system is set up to make them look selfish. It's a system problem. Now, we can't really get away from this. We have to have layers. We can't have every team facing the user. But we definitely can keep this heuristic in mind and try and minimize those layers. And yeah, here's a bunch of other heuristics in this category. And I just have one main thing to talk about, which is resilience. So we talk about this a lot, don't we, about boundaries. Let's find those perfect boundaries. If we just find the perfect boundaries and everyone's autonomous, it will be perfect. But those perfect boundaries don't exist. I'm sure we've all found this out by now. You just can't find the perfect boundaries. There's always compromises. There's always coupling and dependencies. We can't get away from it. And we probably wouldn't want that anyway. Because when things work together, when they integrate, when they combine, when teams work together, that's when good things happen. That's when creativity happens. So I also want to challenge you to think about resilience patterns. So when there are dependencies, which there will be, how can we deal with those dependencies better? Let's not try and design the perfect systems which have no dependencies, because you're guaranteed to almost fail. How can we deal with those dependencies better? Let's start looking for resilience patterns. Let's try inner sourcing. If I need your team to update your API so I can add a text box to a web page, I was going to create a pull request in your code. So I can take the people to the work. We can have some resilience here. But this isn't going to work if I don't know your code and your systems and your team. So why don't we rotate people between teams? I'm going to pair up with someone from your team for like 2 days every month so I can understand what your team works on better. And then, when I have a dependency on your team, I can actually contribute to solving the problem, to work on resolving the dependency with you. But we can go even further and have full-time rotation. Every 2 months or every 6 weeks, one person moves into a different team and stays there until they're rotated again. We encourage this resilience, having knowledge of different parts of the system by working on them on a full-time basis. But someone beat me to this. She wrote an amazing book about it. So you can go read this awesome book called Dynamic Reteaming by Heidi Helfen, I think her name is. So I'm almost finished now. Just need one more sip of water. So people can leave comments on YouTube. I like this talk, but he drinks way too much water. That's a real comment, by the way. So how do we find this balance between all of these different competing heuristics? So I think, firstly, let's build up our collection of patterns and heuristics. Let's start looking for these different patterns at the strategic level, at the resilience level. There's a lot of opportunities here for things we haven't looked at before. And this will help us to build different perspectives. So here's just a few examples. Business models and strategy, capabilities. You're a big fan of TOGAF, aren't you? Let's all learn TOGAF. Social dynamics, organization design, financial intelligence. I've been learning about all of these things, and all of these things are on my mind when I'm designing systems and the shape of teams. It's all super relevant. And so I just have one final thing to say to you. As system designers and builders, you are going to make million-dollar decisions. But you have a choice. You can choose whether you realize it or not. I'm finished. I'm drinking more water now. Thank you.